Welcome, everyone. My name is DJ Wells with the Mensa Research Institute and with Mensa Medical. And you've joined us for a special conversation. For the past several weeks, we've been doing weekly conversations about coping with the COVID pandemic. But in the last few weeks, in the last couple of weeks, last month or so, we've had another a pandemic of conscience that has kind of swept the nation with the unfortunate events, the horrible events surrounding George Floyd, surrounding Breonna Taylor, surrounding Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. There seems to be a new social movement going on that has kind of challenged the, shall we say, the collective mental health of our country. And so we thought it would be important to talk about that collective mental health and how do we as individuals contribute to that conversation? How do we have that conversation with our family members, with our children? How do we feel comfortable ourselves in navigating this time of crisis after crisis, during this time of social unrest, while we're still wrestling with this pandemic and the after effects of the pandemic and our mitigation strategies for overcoming that. So we've assembled for you today a really exciting panel, a number of friends of Mensa Medical, folks that we've worked with in the past on several of these webinars and other things, some psychologists, some experts, some advocates from across the country. We've got Dr. Karen Brown, who's in Florida, Dr. Patricia Perez, who's in Illinois, Dr. Deanza Spalding, who's in Seattle, Washington. I always have to say Seattle, Washington, because if you say Washington, you might mean Washington, D.C. But we've asked the three of them to join us to have a conversation with Dr. Mensa so we can talk about this collective mental health concern that is sweeping the nation, this change in conscious, this new normal. I've used that term several times talking about the pandemic, and I've been slapped on the wrist several times for using it, and I hope I get slapped on the wrist again because there is no such thing as normal these days. And so I want to encourage all of you to make this a interactive activity. If you have questions of any of our panelists, if you want to chime in on the conversation, please do use the Q&A tab that's at the bottom of your screen. Click on that, type in your questions, and we're going to let Dr. Mensa kind of lead the conversation for the next 45 minutes or so. But then after that, I will then share the questions that you all are sending to us with our panelists so that we can get those questions answered as well. We want this to, again, to be a conversation where all of you have an opportunity to participate as well. So with that in mind, let's turn it over to Dr. Mensa and our panelists. Thanks again to all of you for being with us today. Dr. Mensa, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. And to our trifecta of expertise, I want to say thank you for sharing your time and your energy and your vision and perspectives. We have a last minute different kind of a thing that we're going to start off with here. I didn't anticipate doing this, but it just sort of popped into my head. Yesterday, I asked Dr. Stevens a very interesting question with regard to the way different countries are handling COVID. And I said, well, this is going to seem kind of sexist, but I have to ask a simple question. We've seen research that has shown that countries that are spearheaded by females seem to be doing better with the COVID handling than countries by males. And truth be told, there seems to be an even proportion between the two, but there's a difference in approach. And I'm going to ask the three of you, yes, it is a bit off topic, but I'm going to ask the three of you, how do you perceive the handling of COVID from a, forgive me, female perspective here in New Zealand by the Prime Minister there, who's a wonderful, dynamic lady, and some of the other countries? What do you think are sort of the wonderful I don't want to use the term traits, I want to be careful here, but approaches that perhaps are being utilized by female leadership as opposed to male leadership. And what can we learn from all this? I know I just asked a very simple question, right? So Dr. Brown, actually, I'm going to start off with you because I know you weren't thinking about this. So we have you trying true and off out here.
So, I absolutely don't have a problem getting in trouble with, the general public. So I wanted to, I didn't prepare anything because I wanted my remarks and answers to be very organic. And so you're asking me a question that I believe that I can answer as a female coming from a military perspective and an understanding of how females approach pretty much everything. And for me, it comes from a place of understanding what it means to nurture and what it means to take care of others. And I think, and this is again, my understanding and my experiences coming from a military background, dealing with leaders that are males and leaders that are females. And of course, this is a generalization. I have found that female leaders, they think about taking care of, right? They think about taking care of the soldiers and they think about things that sometimes men just don't think about, like simply getting mail on time, which is very important when you're in a deployed situation. So when you talk about a pandemic and how these approaches look from a female point of view, they think about the little things, the things that may not be the large issues, but they're those small issues that make a huge difference. So those individual, those personal things that will reach those people who, because everybody is looking at the big picture, but sometimes females will see those little intricate things that make a difference in the individual. I hope I answered that.
Oh, indeed. Dr. Spalding, I have to go to you next.
Well, I always appreciate following the lead of my fellow colleague, Karen, and she sparked a lot of just kind of thought and deeper reflection in me, because I think as she was talking about how we're socialized to think as females in this kind of nurturing kind of way, my mind went to this place of needing to be holistic, right? Needing to understand the needs of our community from a really holistic perspective, and how in the midst of everything that's going on with COVID and all of the things that are going on that we see at the surface level, that there's a lot of things that are going on underneath that where people are hurting or people are struggling. This COVID situation has really turned us, kind of tipped everything upside down, not just from needing to shelter in place and be social distancing and things, but it's also impacted our economics. It's impacted just how we navigate our day-to-day lives, how we even grocery shop, how we have to plan every day, not only for ourselves, but for our children and their needs as they're home now doing all of their school from their home environment while we're also working from home. So there's all these little elements that need to be thought of and need to be included in the picture of care in our communities and how we're doing this together and responding to the COVID crisis. And that's what I appreciate about leadership like the president in New Zealand, is that what I really gather from her response and from her leadership is that she's willing to listen deeply, to offer compassion, because there's such a need to understand from the perspectives of everyone in the community how this is impacting their lives, and then also including a measured response by also taking in the science and the safety protocols and all of those policy pieces that also need to be enacted to ensure the safety and well-being and health of all our citizens. So yeah, I truly have appreciated looking towards New Zealand and other countries that have just led with so much integrity in that way and with a holistic view in mind for all their citizens.
Absolutely, absolutely powerful. You know, that word compassion is something that is rarely really uttered in conversations around COVID. We're so busy trying to manage a situation, manage a phenomenon. One of the things that the two of you, and Dr. Brown have echoed, is this whole point of detail, because when you're talking about compassion, you're looking at the small things. What is it that actually upsets, balances, helps, preserves at a micro level that has macro effects, as Dr. Stevens and I were talking about yesterday? I think that's very, very important. Dr. Perez, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts. I always have a lot of thoughts, but before we get started on those, I wanted to thank again Dr. Mensah and Mr. Wells, and also Miss Marian Tafreshi, who I think is here, for gathering us all together. Thank you so much, and for us to be able to have this dialogue. So I think, you know, when I think about this is number one, on a macro level, it's a very complex phenomenon to think about a woman in leadership and to compare it to a man who's in leadership. The way that I'd like to organize my thoughts is based on personal and professional, because I have those hats, and then also really just myself. And it's an evolving thing. The last 2 times that I've been a presenter here, I've talked about context. And so from a personal point of view, being a leader, I would say, you know, and I think many of you already know this, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, and I actually lead in my family and understanding and supporting our family during this time, in the pandemic, during the social unrest, and our topic for today. And it's similar yet different from my husband, for example. So he says things like, Trish, without you, it feels like there's no pilot to the plane. Although I say to him, well, but nothing's crashing, right? And so there's this thing about also leadership in terms of whether you're task oriented, right? You're task oriented, or you're more like process oriented. And so it's an art. Like, being a leader is an art. So there's individual differences, and like in New Zealand, we don't know the context of how that socialization that Dr. Spalding was talking about is similar yet different than in other countries. So like, for example, in my home country of the Philippines, I mean, there's a very different way of understanding who has and who doesn't have resources during the pandemic. So you can either, you know, people have things and they can sit in their homes and be in the stay-at-home order and lockdown, or you're looking for food. I mean, there's that. So the response of a female really in that context really can be very insular within the family system, right? And then moving on to the professional realm, when I think about a female lead, sometimes what's interesting here is whether or not the female is even, I guess, supported to be the lead, right? And even if you wanted to be the lead, whether or not you have that support from your community, or like, for example, all the global projects I do, how you get, as an outsider looking in, supporting that person to be the lead in something like this. Now, if we talk about individual traits and qualities, I mean, you know, there's the stereotypical thing is that women are nurturers, you know, women gather, you know, those type of things. However, females can also have the assertiveness, right, making decisions, and have the wherewithal like men. So I don't know if I gave answers, but the way that I answer questions is really more giving considerations, because my role in international psychology as core faculty is really to give a lot of those contextual processes and products in order for whatever action happens. But when I think about a lot of these leaders, whether they're female or not, those are the things that I think about.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to step out there on a slightly different version of that, and I'm not going to tell you all about yourselves. You're the experts on female considerations here. My business partner, who keeps me balanced, is a female, Dr. Judith Bowman. She's absolutely brilliant. Back in school, I mentioned yesterday in our discussion with Dr. Stevens, when I was in medical school, my little clique was basically 3 females and me. So I was the only male surrounded by these 3 people who consistently kept me in check in a variety of ways, including teasing the daylights out of me more days than not. Everything from apparel to who knows what. But what I came to understand in my interactions in studying and problem solving with females, I have never met a female who did not problem solve by way of looking at things from a different angle than I did. And what seems to me to be, and I can't say this is a socialization, this is where you guys are the experts on this, but what I see somehow seems to be almost an inherent capacity to multidimensionally approach a problem. Some of the oddest study habits I've ever seen that made sense and worked that I've never forgotten came from my female colleagues. Okay, how do you remember this factoid? How do you approach this piece in this program, in this process? And it's my consideration that these same different wiring pieces are part of the equation that's really important in assessing and dealing with any kind of troublesome or problematic situation, including a pandemic. And as the 3 of you have said so well, being able to see the tiny pieces, what is the next step? What is it that we're looking at in terms of the pieces that need to be in place so that we can actually accomplish this program, this route that you're talking about, as opposed to simply saying, well, we're going to fix the problem and we're going to throw this at it and we're going to throw that at it. Come the details. And I've been quite honored, I think, and really blessed to be able to work with so many wonderful, I don't want to sound sexist, but wonderful women, because they have helped me become the person that I am, with the capacities and the perspective. Because even now, when I approach situations and problems, one of my first thoughts is, okay, what is Dr. Bowman going to say about this and how is she going to approach it? Because she's going to hold me accountable. Okay. So that was one of the considerations I had. Basic wiring. Do you find, when we go back to really structural concepts in your studies of psychology, were you ever told that there was actually a different wiring involved between the mind of a male and a mind of a female, the brain of a man and of the brain of a female? Or is that just old husband's tales?
Well, I mean, from a developmental point of view, when I used to teach child development, we talk about from the prenatal, the interplay between nature and nurture, and how, I mean, just even from that level, that there is, based on the interplay between, right, organic and non-organic, the brain and the environment and your genetic constitution, that over time, generationally, and the next iteration of generations, that imprinting will continue, and those neural pathways that are actually created and continue to be used will be there, and then other things will be dropped. And so that can be very individualized, and it could be very familial system wise and cultural. So those are all of the things that we consider when we think about how men and women respond. I mean, the other things that we talk about in international psychology, it's not even just that, it's also like what environmental experiences, we have an organizations and systems track and we have a trauma track. If we look at those lenses too leads us to have those different types of, I guess, imprinting over time. So from a developmental point of view, there is that what we consider, which is our bias, that interplay. It's not just one or the other.
And of course, while it seems like we're moving a little bit off the topic here, I'm looking at the foundational structure here, because this is what ultimately leads to decision making. This is what ultimately leads to the approaches by which we all become effective. And Dr. Brown, you having been in the military, which is, of course, heavily male-dominated. Do you see the females, perhaps the few or maybe even the many, who've been in positions of authority and direction, taking a different approach, or are we more or less stratified in the military to follow the very specific guidelines and everyone conforms?
Well, it depends. In some ways, I'll say from experience, a lot of the females will line up or align themselves with the typically male perspective. Why? Because it's easier. It's easier to get along. It's easier to fit in. But you will find that those who are very successful at what they do in leadership positions, you will find that they will, while they maintain that level of masculinity, stereotypical behaviors, they will also kind of branch out, and they will become those that will are more detail oriented, that will talk more to the troops on a more personal level. So our male leaders would say, say a soldier comes in and they have a problem. Hey, let's talk about the overall problem and how we're going to fix it. But we will find that the females will ask, okay, we have this problem, but how's your social life? Are you sleeping well at night? So different, they come at it from a different perspective. And I do understand, that it's, everything is contextual. We know that. We've learned that over, the course of several years. However, I can speak to this in the military. I can speak to this in churches. Where you have the men in the church, they want to talk about, hey, here's the issue, here's the fix. But you'll find the women in the church that want to talk about, what's really going on, and finding out what's your home life like, and how's your marriage, and how are your children doing. And so they go that extra step. And I believe, again, just generalizing, that men are very comfortable with allowing women to take those types of roles, even in the military. So I would have my commander come in and say, hey, here's a problem with the soldier. First Sergeant, I need you to find out what's really going on, because we don't talk like that, right? Because I'm a man, and I'm not trying to get all into his business. Well, I didn't have a problem getting into his business, because I was, they expected that. And it was not as, they were very more open to me as a female versus, they would tell me stuff that they would never tell another male. And I think it's because, and again, generalizations here, I think it's because women are more apt to ask those intimate questions that men may be uncomfortable asking. And so we can get a lot more information than maybe the male counterparts could.
So let's take this to a slightly different topic, but it has the same premise underlying it. In terms of now what we've seen with the ethnic challenges, I don't want to use the term race, because quite literally we're all the same race. It's the human race. But our subdivisions, subcategorizations that are in many ways fairly artificial constructs have led to divisions. And when we look at this problem, one of the challenges is that we've been looking at it in many ways, shapes, and forms from a male-dominated perspective. When we take a look at this situation and we turn it, we bring in the words compassion. That was brought up earlier in our discussion. We bring up the idea of, okay, context, brought up by Dr. Perez. When we look at all the other commentaries brought in by Dr. Spalding, these are all elements that really should be applied to now what is our new pandemic, the second pandemic, involving the whole concept of how we treat each other based upon delineations of color, of perceived behavior, a lack of really truly getting to know what the situation is, but just reacting. Okay, these are the challenges that we're seeing. And so now I'm going to actually go to Dr. Spalding. Okay, and Dr. Spalding, would you care to sort of elaborate on that? When you look at this situation that we're dealing with now, aren't these tell me, do you see these as being difficulties involving a lack of these very key words being applied within the circumstances at hand?
It's an important question, especially given in light of what we're all facing right now, with everything that's going on in the Black Lives Matters movement and protesting and people's responses all across the globe. And I think I was grateful for the reminder that that context is important, that those references are important, because I know that that looks different in terms of what our responses look like depending on what that context is. So speaking from my perspective and where I'm at, I'm here in Seattle, and I'm in the heart of the city. I'm in the heart of where a lot of the protests are taking place. I'm a trauma therapist, and much of my work is centered around BIPOC community. My clients are BIPOC, that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, who are experiencing the trauma at an increasing rate due to the fact that the things that we are fighting and resisting and even protesting about have to do with systems that have been in place for over 400 plus years. So I think in trying to address that that question around, how we understand, how we think about this, or how we approach this, I think a lot of that, especially when we talk about the divisions ethnically or even gender-wise, a lot has to do with how we're socialized, or how we're socialized to think about ourselves, or how to think about the majority, and how we're supposed to position ourselves in relation to the majority. And so when people see the response from the BIPOC community as pain and outrage to the wrongful deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so many more, and don't have full understanding of how that impacts them individually, their families, the things they have to think about on a day-to-day basis for their own safety, for their own survival, just to jog down the street or drive their car across town. It is incredibly important that we're doing the work to understand that from the perspective of those that are being most harmed in our communities. And that the way we see those things are very much have to do with our environment and how our society has informed how we're supposed to position ourselves around these systems that have been oppressive. So we can't talk about being holistic or having those deep listening skills or compassion if we're not really listening to those that are most impacted by what is going on in this society and what has been going on for 400 plus years in this society. And that is a major call out to the white community, to POC groups that are not Black. We have a big role to undertake in coming alongside and really hearing and understanding that from those that are most impacted by what's going on.
Dr. Perez.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I would say, I'm going to put my, again, personal hat on. As a mother of 3 kids, okay, everyone knows, many of you know here, that I am a diversity and inclusion advocate and consultant. And that's what I do in my core faculty role. I lead that. And, you know, again, just like Dr. Spalding was talking about, a lot of how we answer, lead, act, and behave is all those years of how we were shaped, right? Whether it's biology or whether it's experiences, our environment, and how we react to all of that, okay? So as a person who is not in the United States, not considered Black and not considered white or considered white, it's been a very interesting thing, which is not a new issue. This is not a new issue at all. All of this is not a new issue. So from my personal perspective, what's really interesting is that I find personally sometimes that my friends who identify as Black, African American, or consider advocates of the Black Lives Matter movement, they say to me, Trish, are you part of this? Or people who don't, that I see in all my walks of life, say, are you part of me here? Because they see me here. They don't see me either here. Now, in my own core values and how I was trained and who I am, which I come from a human rights family, I am very similar to Dr. Spalding, where I support marginalized communities and vulnerable populations and anyone who doesn't have a voice. It's really, really important to me. My parents actually taught me that, but at the same time, they were immigrants from the Philippines. I'm originally from the Philippines. And what they also taught me was to assimilate into the dominant society. So there was that dilemma, right? How much do we honor our culture and how much do we not say anything? So that, I mean, that alone is always someone in the back of my mind, coupled with my own personal, you know, I'm a mother, wife, my husband's Armenian American, our kids, 3 of them, our daughter, she identifies and says she's white passing, but she considers herself as a person of color, and people challenge her on that and then challenge her and say, which side are you on? Because you look white, but you should be really, you know, focusing on this. Our second child, he identifies as a person of color, and our youngest is on the autism spectrum. So, and what we do is we walk around our neighborhood and he sees Black Lives Matter, and I have to try to explain this to him when he doesn't understand at 11-year-old level. So it's this whole thing is really, I would say, quite heartbreaking. And now I'm going to shift to the professional, in my professional role, where I take students on field experiences, which is like a study abroad, it's a course, and taking them, what it really reminds me of is taking students to Ghana, and where we actually, one of the activities there to understand the historical context and racial injustices and human rights issues is the fact of going to the slave castles in Cape Coast, Ghana. And many of our Black and African American and Caribbean students, especially for them, I feel a little like emotional just being there. I've been there 7 times to these 2 slave castles there, and understanding the over 400 years of what has transpired there, really knowing that our guides, which is the same guide, his name is Justice, our guide there, who would say to us, the white man didn't start it. It's the West African chiefs who started because they wanted goods, they wanted stuff. And so then they decided then that humans were going to be that stuff to barter for other things. And the Portuguese started it all off in the 15th century, the historical context again, of accepting this business arrangement that has now continued over time, that has then continued the social construct of things like colorism. So it's really just, and knowing, like I was trained in counseling psychology, that there's human potential for everyone, regardless of whatever is going on. So those are my reflections. That's how that's, because we can't not see the personal side of someone who's a professional, because that, although we try to not have bias and things like that, that is the background. There's always that background when we make statements, when we talk about things.
Thank you, Dr. Perez. Dr. Brown, we've been talking about the police department. We've been focusing on the police, and we've had a lot of conversations in both directions about the exceptional few individuals who have been challenging and not really supporting the role of to serve and protect, as opposed to the majority who really do seem to fall in that category. And then, but here's the question. Now, it's one thing to try to address the situation, to address the problem at the level of the police and what mayors and governors may do within their jurisdictions. But no one's talking about the actual justice system itself. We have judges who sit and make decisions quite often in a very disparate fashion, and that's well documented, it's understood. But part of what people have said during this time is, we've been talking for 400 years trying to explain, and you're not hearing us, okay? That doesn't go simply to the police. That doesn't go, this is of course systemic. It is part of a hierarchy, and ultimately it starts and ends with laws and those who interpret the laws. So why, for example, are people not talking about the judges, okay, who sit down and decide that one individual who steals a loaf of bread is going to get 20 years. Another person who's sitting there of a different ethnic group, who is literally eating someone's face, doesn't get shot and is set free. Who is actually addressing this concept of our judicial system and the role it plays? Because every police individual knows what's going to happen for the most part to a given person. They have a good idea when they're brought to the judge. But the judges are not being addressed. The idea of how they dispense justice is not being addressed as well. Now, why are we talking about this with a physician in a mental health construct? All this is extremely stressful. People were first stressing out about the pandemic. Now we have our people stressed out about racial and ethnic issues. The rest of the world, and we have colleagues all over the world who talk about the pandemic, but they're all chiming in and asking us, how are you guys doing this? Is it really like that? We're shocked, we're mortified, we're praying for you, we're hoping for the best, things have got to change, But what does that mean to the average person? And this is where we come to the three of you again. Your practices. What are you hearing from people now at this next level of stress, this next level of unrest? Everything that's perceived in terms of pandemic or social disruption now goes back to affect the so-called, I call it so-called economy, and the Dow Jones and all these other fictitious constructs. I'm just going to go out there and say it. Okay, it's influenced by perception. But then that all comes back to, now I'm very stressed. Now I'm anxious. I'm going to pick up the phone, call Dr. Brown, Dr. Spalding, Dr. Perez. I'm going to set up an appointment because I can't handle the stress. And it's now cumulative. So what are the three of you, and I'll go back to Dr. Brown again, what are the three of you seeing in your practices that is now amplified exponentially? Because you're working at 3 to 4 different layers, all interrelated, all interactive, but at the same time, you've got to tease those things apart, or do you? So, Dr. Brown, how has all this really impacted your practice? And how do you approach different people? I know it's all contextual, but share with us. What are you seeing?
You ask a lot of questions, and it's not an easy answer, but I will do my absolute best because I've got answers for every single thing you just said.
Wonderful. We can't wait.
First of all, I will say that as a person of color, as a Black, African-American, whatever you want to call me, female, this is not new to us. Trauma is not new to us. We have been traumatized for over 400 years. And we have been living with this trauma for over 400 years. And I agree with Dr. Spalding when she said, or whoever, I'm sorry if I'm mistaken, that we were forcibly assimilated. And so that had an impact upon us. I've talked to several people who have said, you know, over the past few weeks that they've finally realized that I had a young male who said, I purposely go around and talk to people in my office so that if anything happens, they don't see me as a threat. Why should he have to do that? Because he's been traumatized. And it is very contextual. And so I want to use this analogy that I heard that I thought was amazing. And it's an analogy between history and what's happening now and the game of Monopoly. I'm sure you've heard it. So, but I want to add to that, because this game of Monopoly that the game master is playing, first of all, the game master stole that game and brought it in and said, hey, we're going to have all these participants play. But for the first 400 rounds of this game, those who don't look like the game master cannot purchase anything at all. And if this person who doesn't look like the game master rolls 3 doubles, they go to jail, right? Now, the game master has taken all of the get out of jail free cards from the pack and distributed them to people who look like the game master. So now the only time that this other participant can get out is if they throw another double. But when they get out, those 400 rounds only count. They only count for that person, the ones that don't look like the game master. Okay, now we've gotten these 400 rounds, and as you pass go, you normally get $200, right? Well, for this person who doesn't look like the game master, you have to pay the game master 100 of those 200 you got, right? Because I made the rules. The game master made the rules. Now, after the 400 years, for the next 50 rounds, you're allowed to purchase property. But what property are you going to purchase, because it's all been brought up? So the game master can now rent this property to you. However, when the game master lands on your property, which, by the way, the only properties that you can afford are those first 4 as you pass the go, right? Those are the cheapest properties, and they gather the least rent. But if the game master lands on those 4 properties, they don't pay you any rent. Why? Because the game master owns it. They own it, right? So now we have a policy that after 50 rounds, so we've got the 400 rounds, now we've got this 50 rounds, now we have someone that comes and gives oversight to the game master and say, hey, this is not fair. You have to do better. And now the game master is upset because the game master says, well, it's not fair to allow them to catch up, because now it discriminates against me and those who look like me. But here's the other thing. The participants cannot leave the game. Where else are they going to go? What other games are there available for them to play? 0. There's no other games. So at some point, those who don't look like the game master, they probably feel like they want to flip the table and start it all over. And we're going to start this game all over. Now that we have some type of oversight that says you have to play fair, and the game master is upset because I don't want to do this, because I'm in control, and the benefit is for the game master, right? So we're talking about this in the context of a Monopoly game, but that's what actually happened in reality. And so we can talk about what happened in Africa and who was at fault for, starting the slave trade. The bottom line is, and the thing that's very critically important for us to understand in the United States is, when the Africans arrived here, and once they were released from slavery, the impact that the conditioned mindsets of both sides, of all sides, it still remains. So I had a conversation with a gentleman. He's talking to me about post-colonialism, which I personally believe is a myth. Colonialism is still, it is still rampant. The goal of colonialism, we're still talking to our kids. I had to teach my child about manifest destiny, you know, that we're supposed to, you know, as Americans, not me though, as white Americans, that they're supposed to own this country from sea to shining sea, right? Doesn't matter that there were people here prior to them coming. That is what they taught, and that's what they still believe. Today, they may not say it in those terms, but the reactions and the actions that are happening, that continue to happen, you know, you asked me about you know, historical context. The historical context is that the compassion will never, ever come, like Dr. Spalding says, unless there is a willingness to consider those alternatives, those different perspectives, right? And so when they are unwilling to do that, then it takes drastic measures. And I've had several conversations with people over this past, you know, few weeks that talk to me about what you are such, you know, okay, I'm gonna just be real. You are such a credit to your race. Whoa. Right? You're so well spoken and you're educated. Why are they looting and rioting and protesting? And I have to ask, tell me what's the difference between these protesters, these looters, and these riots? Because all you see are Black and brown bodies, and you have not taken the opportunity or you know, you haven't taken the opportunity to figure out what's what and who's who. So you lump them all together. Why? Because you are unwilling to consider alternate perspectives, right? And so when we get to that point, and we have to understand that transgenerational trauma is real. It is absolutely real. That's my focus. And we have to recognize that when we start talking about these things, the game master is very uncomfortable. The game master does not want to lose control. Why? Because we still live in a colonistic society. And capitalism is the rule. And so if I have to share with you, that means I'm going to lose something. But that's really not the truth. It's really not the truth. But again, when you are unwilling to entertain any other perspective but your own, you will never see that. So that to me is the problem. And when we talk about judges and the political system or the judicial system, it actually has been addressed. There's an organization called #Cut50. Van Jones is the founder of it. And he talks extensively about the disparities in the justice system. The Department of Justice actually did a study. I did a forensic psychology, I did a master's in forensic psychology, and they had a huge study. It went for about 10 years. And the Department of Justice themselves, you know, they put out this report about the disparities, not only in sentencing, but even arrests. And so this information is out there. It just, you know, people don't care. Because like you said, there's policies that need to be changed. And so what we're doing here in Crestview, Florida, I am working with the police department. I am working with the mayor and the city manager and city hall. And we're doing teachings and classes and courses. And we're doing policy reviews. And we're rewriting hiring practices. And we're doing all these things because I cannot change America without changing my contextual place where I am right now. And so, you know, it's a complex issue. It didn't happen overnight. It's not going to be solved overnight, but I believe that if we each do our part where we are and be committed to it and be dedicated to it and be real about it and not just use it as a tool to progress in our profession, in our for people to like us on social media, get the likes and all that kind of stuff. If we really truly are invested in change in America, we have to start where we are, and we have to do those intimate, minute, detailed things that will make a difference.
Because that is the starting point.
Absolutely.
You've got to start somewhere, and you've got to get to the core of the matter. And in order to understand the core, you have to listen, you have to understand, yes. You have to investigate. Thank you for sharing that. I was not aware of that tremendously large study for 10 years. We've seen here in Chicago, we hear about, of course, this has been discussed and but things haven't changed. So this is very, very important. Dr. Spalding, how has your practice been impacted at this juncture? What are your clients coming to you in terms of considerations, concerns? What are they sharing with you? And what are you sharing with them as some potential capacities, some potential methods to help shift their own internal dynamic, one more towards balance, perhaps peace, and perhaps even hope?
Yeah, that's such an important question to consider. I'm thinking about what Karen shared here because I think that she really outlined what the context of the situation is in such a important and powerful way. I wanted to just throw out there another resource, a book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. It's something that speaks to the judicial hierarchy and the pervasiveness of systematic racism in the United States. And there's other resources within that speak to to the entirety of the system, because when we think about police brutality, we know that it's part of a larger system of racism here in the United States. And so it's important for us to understand all of those pieces and just how those are all intertwined and interconnected, and how we play a role either complicitly, like just following along in that without questioning it, without being critical, without having a critical analysis to it, or how we begin to disrupt the narrative by having a critical lens and really looking at how those systems oppress and brutalize, particularly Black and brown lives here in the United States. That's why I think people show up after these incidences of abuse by police, is because it is a moment in which everything in their bodies just rises up to say, no more, enough is enough. I cannot take this anymore. I will not see this happen in my community anymore. And the tremendous impact that has on their families, on their communities, and on their own personhood. And so what I'm seeing in my practice as a trauma therapist is just a resurgence of a post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma response reoccurring in the body and in the brain for individuals that, again, are faced with the realities of these atrocities and oppressions at the hands of those that are supposed to be servants of our communities and who are supposed to serve and protect, and who are using their power to subjugate and to oppress people, and that end in lives being taken. And so I've had people coming in talking to me about what that looks like for them day in and day out. People losing sleep, people feeling anxious, hypervigilant about their own safety, their children's safety, their husband's safety, their brother's safety, their uncle's safety. I had clients who, I have a Tanzanian immigrant client who was talking to me, and he said, coming from Tanzania, I never really had to think about it like this. I never had to think about me going out for a jog was potentially life-threatening. And now going out for a jog just is the things he has to think about to even get out and to do something that is so life-giving to him is just a new way of operating in the world, and creates a level of trauma response in people to have to scan for safety and plan and prepare for where those safe places are within our communities, and knowing that that may not be the police, that may not be happening within within those places where there's supposed to be safety. So it is coming up for people in a real way, in terms of their anxiety, and in terms of then, after experiencing such high intensity and frequency of anxiety, then the aftermath of being completely drained and then depressed, and their systems being fatigued, and feeling those kind of adrenal fatigues in their system, and having difficulty getting out of bed or thinking or focusing or concentrating. And that cycle just continuing over and over and over again. And what that really means for their overall health, and how they're really holding and experiencing those stressors. There's a lot of concerns related to that. So for me, again, I know we talked a while ago about domestic violence and a pandemic, and I think a lot of my approach is similar. Like, first of all, just making a lot of space for that pain, because it's real, it's valid, it's in response to real oppression that is occurring, abuses that are occurring, and giving people the opportunity to be able to speak to that and to be validated in that helps to kind of bring them back to their body and feel grounded and centered. Finding ways for them to continue to connect within their community that's meaningful and also empowering is a really important part of people feeling a sense of hope or a sense of progress in the movement forward. And then again, doing a lot of the work to help people's brains and their central nervous system, breathing, mindfulness, eye movement desensitization, reprocessing, those pieces, so that people can actually find some calm in their body, because it's a lot to sustain a heightened level of PTSD day in and day out. So finding ways to therapeutically and clinically respond to that, to give them a little bit of support to what their neuropsychological systems are responding to.
And certainly when we've completed this journey that we're sharing together, we're hopeful that the three of you can offer resources where people can call to try to get some help, to share, to find whatever it is they need. So we'll certainly do that. You said something very interesting, and Dr. Perez, I want you to pick up on this, because you did something very interesting for me the other day. You sent me a link that shows Sesame Street characters explaining what is going on. So Dr. Perez, I'd like you to talk about, you talked about your 11-year-old autistic child. I want you to share with everyone how you explain to a child what is going on now. Children are not stupid, but they're highly empathic. They feel what's going on. They see it. They may not understand it, but they know something is just not right. Dr. Perez, how do you approach the child in explaining and sharing and in healing in this?
I mean, that's a very complex question. And
right, you got 60 seconds, right?
Okay, I have 62 minutes. Okay, well, all the students on the call and colleagues and former students on the call. Okay, now you get to see it in 2 seconds. Okay.
No, I'm kidding.
I mean, I know. So from a developmental point of view, obviously, which is also very culturally based and contextually based on what those standards are of understanding from the dominant culture, we have to think about them in terms of whether they're 0 to 3, right? 3 to 5, the preschool years, whether middle childhood, early childhood, whether they're adult, teenagers, young adults, those types of things. So we have to contextualize that. On the other hand, when we think about children with special needs, especially, I mean, to try to explain COVID is quite interesting too. And I explained that during our presentation on that. But what I usually say is when I consult with parents, what do they actually understand? Now, as far as explaining just what is things like racism, what is things like differences, I think it starts from day one. Okay, so it doesn't start now. It actually starts from day one. But if we're looking at our 11-year-old who is on the autism spectrum, the way, and I believe in things that are organic, we walk around our neighborhood, which is part of his routine. Children typically who have autism like routines, so we continue that. Then guess what? It says Black Lives Matters, okay? And there are things there. And so he asks me questions, he's verbal. So he could say, what does this, right? And I go, this is a group of friends. He understands the word friends, okay? I could say something else. I could say, no, don't look at it. I mean, you know, I'm the parent. I could totally steer the conversation to say, no, don't look at it. But what I say is, it's a group of friends who fight with their words. Okay, this is how I've explained it to them, because I don't want him to be starting like gathering in a group of friends and start like punching people, and he doesn't know what that means. So gathering a group of friends for something that people believe in. Like, do you love family? He's like, I love family. I go, do you love so-and-so? I love so-and-so. So it's like these really, for him, it's really baby steps, as opposed to our teenager and a young adult who are out there protesting, who understand it. We have, you know, movie night. We just saw Just Mercy together. We have conversations about that, right? But for him, he was included in all of this, although he may not understand it. He would ask questions, right? He would ask questions like Just Mercy, and then he would read all of the stuff that Brian Stevenson from that movie would say, okay? So then he will ask questions again, although he's verbal, right? The other thing too that we do, and I did this when we were young, because my daughter, again, is very fair-skinned and I'm not, and people would make assumptions of who I am. We would take like I did this today, we'd take our, you know, I'm like, same or different. And we would say it with our skin color, he's like, different. And it's like, well, what's mommy? Mommy's brown. What's Luke? Luke is tan. And then he's like, and I go, I love Luke. He's like, I love mommy. So this models, right? This models that we may be different, right? But we love each other. I mean, and so this is also the conversations that we have in our neighborhood about similarities and differences. So talking about some of these things in that way, we're still evolving. I'm still trying to, and we have social stories too. Children on the autism spectrum, and I'll send that to you as well as a resource, that there is actually a social story that has been developed, the resource is not from the state, that actually explains George Floyd's death with pictures and short sentences that helps children, at least with limited language, limited understanding, and, you know, on the autism spectrum. So I think that they've developed. So these groups who are advocate for children with special needs, because it is a very hard concept to explain.
How do you explain rioting? 6-year-old comes in your office with a mother, and mom says to you, Dr. Perez, listen, we see all this on TV. My child just happened to be in the room. She said, Mommy, what is this? What is going on? I'm scared.
Okay, yeah, I throw it back at the kid. I mean, again, depending on the child, what do you think? And I always believe that there's always two sides to a story. And I want to know the child's capacity to understand what's going on first. I don't want to tell them what I think, because then that's biased information. That's what I think. Unless it's something where you have a gun, you have a knife, and you're about to, you know, hurt yourself. In our family, and again, it also starts with core values. I want to know the family's core values, like what they believe in. I don't want to tell them, remember how I explained like what works? I mean, what can you do versus what can't you do? So yes. I want to know what the core values are of the family. I want to know what drives them. So I can state like what our core values are, and then that will explain based on those core values, like we fight with our words and not with our fists. I mean, we've talked about that in our family. And not to harm. Another rule and core value we have with that all the 3 kids know is that we don't harm ourselves or harm anybody else. And harm can be physical, emotional, cognitive, all of those type of things. So we use our words to fight, to be agents of change, and to advocate. And so but not every family may believe that, right? So when we look at things in the media, and of course, hopefully the child isn't watching rioting and protests and all of these, potentially graphic things. However, it could be also, I'm going to look at flip side, it could be a teachable moment for kids to understand that people fight for what they believe in, right? And there are different ways of fighting. You can read, right? I mean, you could read a book, you can be out on the streets, you can, educate yourself. There's all of these different ways other than, whatever we want to call rioting or whatever, or we could see it from a totally different perspective, that they're fighting, right? They're fighting for what they believe in, as opposed to all the negative perceptions of them.
Thank you. I know there are questions out there for the three of you, so I'm going to start my own question and answer session here. Although you guys have been you individuals, you doctors have been so amazing. Mr. Wells, what questions do we have for our distinguished panelists here?
We do have a couple of really good questions, and the first one that I want to toss out there might take up the rest of the time that we have, because it's such a complex question, and that is, someone's asking, what about the few bad apples argument that we've heard so often? The fact that it's just a few people who are acting out, but that it's not indicative of the larger system or so many other individuals in the system.
Dr. Brown.
Well, I will say this. Depending on who they're talking about, they're absolutely correct. That there's only a few bad apples, right? But when you talk about, again, contextually, when we look at the whole of the United States, and that's what I can speak to. When we look at the whole of the United States, I've been in panels, I've been in classes, I've been in the military, I've been in units where I have people who tell me, in my town, there were no Black people. I didn't meet any Black people until I joined the military or until I went to college. I can never say that. I can never say that I've ever been anywhere where I was that there were no other people other than Black. Doesn't exist. And so when I ask them, so they don't know what to call me. What do you want to be called? Black, African-American, Afro-American, Negro, colored? What do you want to be called? Because they just don't know, right? And does that mean that they're bad apples? Absolutely not. But because this is not a new situation, police brutality, racism, discrimination against minorities, this is not new. This didn't just happen in 2020. This has been ongoing. We've had people who, I just saw on a social media, a young lady said, the Democrats have fooled you all. George Floyd is not really dead. It's called cognitive dissonance. You don't want to see it. And when you don't want to see it, when you refuse to acknowledge that racism is alive and well, you are complicit in in these things that are happening. So again, it's contextual. Does that make you a bad person? No, it just makes you an ignorant person. And again, it shows that you are unwilling to consider different perspectives. And so we're talking about different, colorism. I want to show you my daughter. Come here. This is my daughter, mine, right? And thank you, baby. And so we go out and people are like, are you babysitting? Are you the nanny? When she was a baby, oh, she's so beautiful. Where's her mother? Right? These are the questions that I get. And it's, I'm used to it now. We find that when we're out and about, people will break their necks trying to watch us and watch her. I've seen grown men walk backwards into shelves and completely tear up the store trying to watch my children, right? And so when we talk about, is it just those few? No, it is a pervasive attitude. This is my perspective. It's a pervasive attitude that I run into everywhere. I have not been one place in the United States, and I've been a lot of places. There is not one place that I have ever been that I don't come up against that cognitive dissonance where there are the majority who believe that, oh, there is no reason for affirmative action. It must have been George Floyd's fault. It must have been Rodney King's fault. Why did they run? If they were innocent, they shouldn't have ran. Just these attitudes, and because they will not or are unable to have a willingness to open their minds and to consider different perspectives, I don't think that it's just the few. I think, and this is my perspective, that it's an overall perspective. And so now we have someone said, I think it was Will Smith. He said, this is nothing new. It's just being recorded now. These things have been happening for years and years and years and years, and we're just now hearing about it. Why are we just now hearing that it was Black females, right, who did all the mathematical computations to bring the astronauts back to the Earth? Why are we just now hearing that? Right? Why are we just now understanding that the history that we contributed to is just now coming up? And so I don't know. I take issue with that question, I guess, because I'm wondering, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the majority being just a few knuckleheads, or are you talking about the minority having just a few knuckleheads?
Dr. Spalding.
You know, when I hear that question around there's only a few bad apples, the context in which I always heard it is in regards to kind of a defense for policing in the United States. And, you know, I think if that's really your perspective, then what I would ask you to do is to actually really go back to the history and really look at the full context of our history and what has been going on here. I ask you to go, and if you don't know him, I'd ask you to go and Google Emmett Till, who in 1955 was pulled out of his house and was murdered by two white men because he allegedly whistled at a white woman. And then when they were put on trial, they were completely released. And later, years later, all the folks in that case, all the white folks in that case, recanted their stories and admitted that they lied. I'd ask you to go back and look at the 1960s and the civil rights movement here in the United States and think about those 4 little girls that went into that church that was bombed and why people gathered and why people called out for change. And we've been doing this decade after decade after decade after decade. So if really the leading thought in people's mind is there's just a few bad apples that that communities of color are responding to and coming out to and protesting against, I would ask you to really consider that question and to really go back to the history and look at those stories, look at how this continues to repeat itself, not just in policing, but in every aspect of our institutions here in the United States, from healthcare to housing to the judicial system. I'd ask you to really look at that with a critical lens, and maybe even doing some of your own anti-racist work to understand why, what's the defensiveness about, what's the denial about that comes up in ourselves in times. Ibram Kendi put together an amazing list of anti-racist reading that I would recommend taking a look at, that you can Google and that you can look at to understand what these systems are, what they look like, why we ask the questions we ask, and how we need to even critically think about what questions we're really asking, and what questions we're not asking, and why. Um, and I'd also recommend looking up, the New York Magazine put together a list of different funds out there to be able to support the movement around Black Lives, for memorial funds, but also for mental health resources and other health resources in there as well. I think that's an important resource to have on hand.
Thank you, Dr. Spalding. Mr. Wells, let's start Dr. Perez off with the next question.
Okay.
Mr. Wells?
Yes,
Okay.
Dr. Perez,
Yes.
one of our viewers is asking about the fact that young people seem to be playing so much of a lead role in this movement. And we've talked about how people are socialized. We've talked about how people are learning a lot of the behaviors and a lot of the perspective that they bring to these circumstances. And yet young people seem to be bucking against some of the things that they were taught. Why and how are young people perhaps going against their socialization, and how and why are they leading this movement?
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks for whoever asked that question. Well, I think there's several things. I mean, I'm going to put my developmental hat, my international psychology hat, my counseling psychology hat, thinking about, okay, so from a foundational point of view, if we think about socialization, like Dr. Spalding and also Dr. Brown talking about, that we've learned all of these things. However, if we consider young people from a developmental point of view, the teen years, early 20s, things like that, that typically around this time, they're risk takers, okay? They're risk takers, they don't think anything's gonna happen to them, right? And they want to fight, okay, whatever the fighting means. Doesn't mean whether it's perceived as violent or not violent, it doesn't really matter, but this is the time to buck the order, right? This from a developmental standpoint, it makes sense. It makes sense that this is the time because they have some autonomy. They from a developmental point of view, they have some autonomy than someone who was 5, right? So, I mean, and also too, right, depending on your first system and role models, which is typically parents or guardians, grandparents, that sort of system, or whoever that main group is, they then can have influence. If they counteract that, it could speak to their need to find themselves as an approaching adult. So I don't know if you can remember yourself as a teenager. I totally remember myself as a 15-year-old in London, England during the 80s. I'm gonna put my age out there. That it was really interesting because there were times where like, oh, this is not totally a complete analogy, but the whole like Gulf War, right? During that time, we're thinking about apartheid, all of these things, whether or not my parents agreed with this type of stuff, we were there, supporting what we believe was just and right within our peer group. And then within the field of social psychology, okay, I'm bringing a whole nother thing, birds of the same feather flock together. And so what is this? It's contagion. So if my best friend, who I love dearly or whatever, is doing this and it's not harming myself or anybody else, then I'm going to do it as well. They also have control. They also feel empowerment. And we want to see that type of qualities as they get older to becoming adults, because when they become adults and they can have a voice, they can be agents of change, they can do all these things. Unfortunately for us parents, they separate from us and become their own person.
Do either of the other panelists want to take a crack at that question?
Well, here in Seattle, where I'm at, in our neighborhood, it's one of the smaller neighborhoods in Seattle. Last Sunday, we had a youth-led march and rally that 10,000 people showed out to. And hearing the youth speak and talk about their experiences and why they were organizing and why they were there, it was really clear that one, there was that movement empowerment that was going on within the youth in that community, like Dr. Perez was talking about, and also just the need for them to be able to coalesce around the same mission and solidarity, and to have a place to respond to the pain, and the trauma that they've been experiencing. So it was a really powerful experience to be led by youth, and to see their empowerment and to see the way that they were showing up for one another, and really calling out the rest of us as a community to also show up and show out.
And I think also that our youth have been, and again, the context that we're living in. We're living in the year 2020. And so our children have come a long way in terms of their own socialization. They interact more with people who don't look like them on a regular basis through gaming communities. And, my son is in the band and he's not a drummer, right? So you know what I'm saying? So our kids they're being more exposed, and they're less tolerant, for the most part. They're less tolerant of discriminatory actions and behaviors. And so I think for a lot of them, they just cannot fathom these types of activities that their parents are just so nonchalant about, and they are outraged. And so they feel like, I have to say something. We had a rally here in my town about a week ago, and it was crazy because the sheriff department here has declared Black Lives Matter and listed it as a terrorist organization. And so there was some concern that the deputies would not support or protect the march and the rally, but they did. But it was a conversation. I don't understand. It was a conversation that our city manager had to have with the sheriff's department for the county. And they did show up. They did participate. Our police chief, who's doing an amazing job here, trying to diversify the department here. But it was led by the young people because, and a lot of them were white, and they just thought, Mom, Dad, why aren't you coming? Why aren't you participating? I want to go because one of my best friends just so happens to be Black, right? We're cheerleaders together, or we play on the same football team, or we're on the same basketball team. We sing in the same chorus. And so they are really clear about boundaries and how they want to protect each other, right? And so while the events that happened in Minneapolis may not have made an impact on some of our white youth, the fact that it made an impact on the Black youth made the white youth want to get involved. And so I think that's a good thing. It's a very good thing, because we find that our children are more receptive and they are more willing to see other perspectives than are the parents who have been socialized to think one way and pretty much one way only. Like, it's okay for me to work with you, but you can't come to visit my house, right? So when we see those young people getting involved like that, we really applaud them and we support them.
We're getting short on time, so I'm just going to toss one last question out here that came in, and one of our viewers is saying, I've heard a lot of people talking about a new awakening in this country, and so I'd like to ask all of you: do you see the George Floyd incident? And the other incidents that have happened recently is kind of changing our national common sense view of the world, that there truly is this awakening that the viewers have asked about here.
Dr. Spalding, let's start with you.
Oh, that's such an interesting question, an important question. I think when I think about it, and I think about the people that I've been working with and organizing around Black Lives Matter for, over a decade now, I feel like this has been something that, like, we've been trying to push forward for a really long time. It doesn't really, I think we're seeing it at a larger scale, but it doesn't look that much different than what we were doing in Ferguson, or what we do in Charlottesville, or any of these other times when Philando Castile was killed in Minnesota as well. Like, there were people that have been coming out for a long time. The Wait riots, the LA riots, like these things have been coming up and swelling up for a long time. I think the difference is that for whatever reason, this interesting time that we find ourselves in the midst of a pandemic and this happening, it put certain, I think, pressures, or it brought this to the forefront in a different way in people's minds that have made them really realize and consider that something really drastically needs to change. I think that's why we're seeing every state in the United States have protests. Like, everyone is showing out in every state to protest what's going on. And that's something new. That's something different, to have that scale of protesting that's happening all across the United States. But I think the message has been the same for decades upon decades upon decades. I think we've been calling for change for a very long time. I just think that the uniqueness of the situation in which we find ourselves in the middle of these multiple pandemic systems, the pandemic of COVID, as well as the pandemic of consciousness, and the political climate in which we find ourselves, has created a certain kind of cocktail that has, I don't know, like, resonated with people at a different level than I haven't ever seen before.
Dr. Perez.
Totally agree with Dr. Spalding. I think just to add to this conversation is also to, when you have people who are potentially mandated to be in your homes also, and we're sort of in and out of perceived society, that it really gives us pause to think and reflect on things that may not be comfortable to us. And so we're thinking about a lot of these things that maybe we may not be thinking about. This also developmental period, unlike other things in US history that apparently could be likened to it, but not at the same time with this, all of these things swirling around, like Dr. Spalding said, is we have social media. We have many streams of whatever. And we have newspaper, fake news, real news, all of these type of things that get overwhelming to try to figure out what that truth is. So those are the ways, and it is a very different time period, and what people know now, right? And we've had all of this history, but I don't personally believe either, based on historical context, based on what's going on, but that this is a new awakening. It's a awakening, I guess, depending on what side you see this as, but it definitely is a very developmental, generational situation now that calls us to be agents of change again. I mean, or calls people to reevaluate and reflect what they believe in humans.
Dr. Brown, you used a very interesting term earlier. You talked about cognitive dissonance. Let's look at America's place in history, in time, as being champions of humanitarian causes and pointing the finger at other countries. The abominations in Angola, the tyranny on the South American continent, in different countries there. For as long as I've remembered growing up here in this country, the United States has always been a leader in the championing of these kind of causes that reflect poor treatment within a given population around the globe. Now we find ourselves being the subject of that same viewpoint directed here by the entire world. There are protests not only in the UK, not only in Australia, there are protests everywhere on this planet against the treatment that people here have seen becoming so casual, so routine, and of course peaking with the Floyd situation. But there are now protests globally. So when we look at context, when we're talking about what our kids are doing here, what about the kids in other countries? What about the adults in other countries that are now coming out in droves with signs? And here's something very interesting. As much as we play the political game, we've also left ourselves very open for political commentary. I'm not here to get into politics, but China is now absolutely in the history books, talking about the hypocrisy of the United States of America, as it's pointed the finger, as the U.S. has pointed the finger towards China in many regards. China turns around and says, well, listen, look what you're doing. This is unconscionable. So, Dr. Brown, let's look at this from a global context. And let's talk about how the United States, of all countries, the former champion, now being the recipient of criticism, the recipient of distrust. And the idea that if the US, a global leader and a superpower, can do this, how do other countries feel relative to their own security when it comes to interactions and dealings with the United States of America?
Well, again, based on my years in the military, I completely understand the word hypocrisy when it comes to the United States. We can look at Vietnam. We can look at how, because it's very easy to point fingers and say, you're not doing this, but we're going to keep our little secret back here at home. And we don't want you to see what we're doing, but we want to, point fingers and try to tell you what you should do and how you need to treat your people better. And it is simple hypocrisy, plain and simple. And, when we went to Global War on Terrorism, that was a huge part of my military career. And it got to the point where as a military member being deployed, I remember us talking about, we are not going to engage in this war because we feel like they've done something so wrong and the United States is so right. We went for two reasons. One is because we had raised our right hand and we swore to support and defend the United States of America, the president and those that are appointed over us. And the second reason is because we knew that we were there to support our battle buddies. We were there and we wanted to come home together, right? We wanted to ensure that whatever we had to do to ensure that we all came home together, that was our point, and that was our goal, that was our mission. And so to understand or to look at now what the world is, the sheet's been uncovered, right? The covers have been thrown back. And so now the world is seeing our dirty laundry. It's been here the whole time. And so it's very easy to see that splinter in your brother's eye, especially when you have a plank in your own, right? That comes from the Bible. And so we understand that, and as long as it benefits the United States, as long as it benefits the United States government, then they will point those fingers. There was no finger pointing during the Rwandan genocide. There was no engagement during that. Why? Because there was nothing that they felt like they could gain from that. So, hey, let it happen. And then afterwards, then they want to go and say, oh, we should have done this and we should have done that. Well, it's kind of late now for woulda, shoulda, coulda, right? And so now here we are in 2020 with our dirty laundries, thrown all over the country, and everybody can see it. We have done more damage to, and I'm speaking in terms of denigrating other countries and their leaders about how they treat their citizens. And those same leaders now have an opportunity to say the same thing about us, and we don't like it. We're upset about it. And we just want, and I'm speaking again in generalizations, we just want this to go away. What do you want? So you ask about this new awakening. Who's waking up? I don't know. Who's waking up? I don't believe that, like the other two on the panel, there is no such thing as the new awakening, because there's a certain section of the United States that never went to sleep. They couldn't afford to go to sleep because they laid down with one eye open, right? Because there was the possibility and the potentiality that they would not wake up at all. And so now when we're talking about this new awakening, my question is, who's finally waking up? Again, I go back to cognitive dissonance. It's not that they didn't know it. It's not that they slept through it, but it's easy to ignore it when it's not happening to me. It's easy to turn a blind eye to it when it's not my family member. It's easy to explain it away when we truly believe, or we refuse to have a willingness to consider other perspectives, that maybe something is really wrong here. Because no one wants to admit that it was my cousin or my brother or my husband that did this awful thing. Had to have been someone else's fault, right? And so we're at the point now where we have to be held accountable for why we got here and and that's the context. How did we get here? Now that we're here, what are we going to do about it? And we can't continue to say, I hope that it just goes away. We can't just protest. We have to change those policies. And it's going to be a long, hard road. And there's going to be some discomfort on all sides, right? Because what I see and what I find is that a lot of minority communities are still apologizing for saying, hey, I'm sorry, but I want to be seen as equal. Oh, excuse me, but can I now sit in the front of the bus, right? They're still apologizing. Why? Because they've been socialized to be marginalized, and we have to change that mindset as well, right? So there's a lot that has to happen, and I appreciate the people that are here on the panel that have committed and are dedicated to assisting making these changes in whatever way they can, where they are, in their little areas of influence, because it only takes one person to change their mind. And so our company, Dr. Spalding and I, we're part of a company called Link International, and our motto is living in context, right? And then we say our goal is to change the world one perspective at a time. And I believe that we can do that.
I think the three of you have already started that pathway for many people who are watching this. I want to thank all of you. It's been a powerful, powerful conversation. And even though things may have seemed in one direction or another at some point, we've really kind of tied together the entire pulse of activity, everything from how are the stressors involving a pandemic, the economic forces, and of course, the cultural and racial discourse that's now just bubbled up to the very surface. Let's just say the universe is consistently pregnant, and many things are being given birth to.
Yes.
And in an era, a time period of extreme history that will be remembered. So I think one of the things we all have to ask ourselves is, as a people, as Americans, what is history going to say about us? Are we going to be proud of our position today when we read about it tomorrow? And what will our future generations say? This is the opportunity to make that right. and to paint the right picture with substance, not just with words. I want to thank the three of you, Dr. Spalding, Dr. Perez, Dr. Brown. We appreciate everything, and thank you for taking your time to be with us today. Mr. Wells.
Thank you, Dr. Mensah. Also, as Dr. Perez so correctly pointed out before, we want to send a special thank you and a special shout out to Miriam Tafreshi, who played a significant role in organizing this and bringing all of us together. And of course, thanks to all of you for spending some time this afternoon with us to be a part of this conversation.
Forgive me. Mr. Wells, resources. Dr. Brown, Dr. Perez, and Dr. Spalding, will you please be able to send us resources to share with our audience, our people who are going to watch this video? And maybe we can post it along with the version of this video that goes online.
Absolutely. That's a very good idea. And so, as Dr. Mensah just said, we are going to post the video replay of this conversation. If you want to revisit some of the great points that were made today, then we certainly encourage you to take a look. We will, in the comments section for this video on YouTube, post those resources that are sent to us by our panelists today. And certainly we encourage you to let your friends and family and colleagues know who might not have been able to join us today. Let them know about this conversation. You'll be able to find it on the Mensa Medical YouTube channel, and we'll also post links to it via our Mensa Medical Facebook page and our Twitter feed. So there'll be several ways that you can find this video. Again, thanks to all of you panelists for being with us today. Dr. Mensah, thanks to all of you for spending time with us, all of you viewers. And we will see you again next week for another Coping with COVID conversation. In fact, I believe Dr. Brown will be joining us again next week. So we'll see you then. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.